Hello everyone, I'm Aprajita, a story scholar with the 1947 Partition Archive, and it is my great pleasure to be your host today. Welcome to the 75 Days of Partition series. This is day 64 of hosting esteemed guests for this series, which will continue till August 17th. Today we will be speaking to Nandita Bhavnani. Let me start by giving a brief bio of her. Nandita Bhavnani is the author of Cindynama, which has been published recently in 2018. Earlier, she wrote The Making of Exile, Sindhi Hindus and the Partition of India, which she wrote in 2014, and I Will and I Can, the story of Jai Hind College in 2011. She has been engaged in extensive research on Sindhi culture and history since 1997 and has also traveled widely across Sindh. She has conducted interviews of partition survivors in India, Pakistan, and the UAE. And we had the pleasure of listening to her earlier on Sunday Stories Live. And welcome again today, ma'am. It's a great
Thank
pleasure
you
to
so
have you
much.
here.
Thank you so much, Aprajita. Thank you, and hello to everyone. It's a real pleasure to be back. I thoroughly enjoyed my session last time, and looking forward to this session too. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I'll directly jump to my first question, which is always about the background because that's where we start. All our research where it starts from. So, what would would you like to share your background on partition and what inspired you to develop research interest in this particular event?
I come from a partition family. Both my parents were teenagers at the time of partition. They migrated to India, to Bombay, and built their lives anew with their families over here. But typically, they did not talk too much about partition. They would talk about Sindh, they would talk about India, but not that much about the process. Okay, so it was there in the background. Um, and as a kid, I also had never really focused on it. And in the year 1997, two, three things happened at the same time. I finished my degree in my master's in anthropology, and at the same time, Dr. Ashish Nandi was doing he started his project on partition violence and memory at the CSTS in Delhi. Okay. And this was a very large project which involves scholars from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. It was a very interesting project because we got to meet all kinds of people and hear different voices and different narratives. Um, so Dr. Ashish Nandi was wanted from me. He wanted narratives of partition survivors who had witnessed violence. So that was my mandate actually. And once I started interviewing people, of course, then it just grew and grew. And after a while, I was talking to partition Sindhi partition survivors of all types, whether they had witnessed violence or not. And as a matter of fact, it was because of the relatively low levels of violence in Sindh, it was very difficult for me to find people who had witnessed violence or who had experienced violence, who had undergone violence. So I ended up just speaking to a lot of people, and then the whole process just snowballed. So that's how it happened.
Uh, yeah, and you have done
But
quite an
I'd like to add one thing here. And in the process, I also found out more and more about what my own family had experienced, which I had never done before. It had never occurred to me to ask. I hadn't realized that there was so much there to ask about. You know.
yes.
So,
Yes,
so
the
it really,
perspective
yeah,
not just on the outside world changes, but inward as well. The
absolutely,
reflections on self
absolutely,
reflections also
yeah,
change.
yeah, yeah.
And you have done quite an extensive research regarding this in these experience of partition. And
Hmm.
like I mentioned in the intro as well, that you have traveled to all these places. You have traveled in India. You have collected stories from Pakistan, UAE, and
Hmm.
you must have reached a lot of conclusions also as a result of all these interviews and interactions with the partition survivors.
Hmm.
So could you also throw some light on, tell us that why was there comparatively less communal violence in Sindh at the time of partition?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, Aprajita. So there are, I think it's a very complex uh, question which requires a complex answer. I don't think there's any one reason as to why there would be violence. Similarly, I don't think there's any one reason as to why there was relatively less violence. So between, I would say, from the announcement of partition, which was 3rd of June, to mid-December of 1947, Sindh witnessed very little violence. There was some violence experienced by Sindhis in Quetta on August 21st, but that was in Balochistan. That was not in Sindh. So in Sindh, basically there was one major outbreak of violence, which was in the central Sindh town of Nawab Shah, where Sikhs who had boarded a train to go to India were massacred on that train. But we're talking about 31 Sikhs who were killed and about 15, 16 who were injured. Okay. And apart from this, there were several stray cases of Hindus who were migrating, who were attacked and looted, sometimes thrown off a train. But in most of those cases, the motive was clearly to get their valuables that they were carrying with them. So that was a very clear motivation. It was partly communal, but partly also economic. Yeah. But apart from this, there were no major riots till December 47. So I find that very interesting. And when I look at it, I see repeatedly in the newspapers, in the literature, I see that the Sindh government was very, very keen to maintain peace and law and order at all costs. Okay. Now, Sindh was fortunate that it was not partitioned like Punjab and Bengal. There was no chaos and confusion as to where the border was. Also, Sindhi Hindus were a clear minority of about 26-27%. Sindhi Muslims had a much larger majority of about 74%. So it was not so equally balanced as it was again in Punjab and Bengal. But nevertheless, when I look at the literature and when I see what the possible reasons for the Sindh government maintaining very firm hand on law and order, I see two, three things. Okay, one is that they didn't want the Hindus to leave because the Hindus were the backbone of the economy. So they knew that if there are riots, the Hindus will just flee from Sindh, and the economy will anyway crumble. As it is, a lot of money had left Sindh. A lot of through the banking channels, a lot of money lenders had begun to leave, and also government servants had begun to leave, which meant government offices could not function. So they were trying very hard to retain Hindus. So that was one reason. Another reason was that at that time, Karachi was the capital of Pakistan. That was, we tend to forget that because we are so used to Islamabad. But at that time, Karachi was the first capital of Pakistan, and there was a lot of violence in Delhi. And given the competition or the competitiveness that basically was that existed between these two nation states from the word go, okay, the Sindh government was very keen to maintain its reputation as a peaceful city, especially in contrast to Delhi. That we are superior in that sense. And this also comes through in various speeches in various newspaper reports and so on. Okay, but more than these cases, of course, I mean these two factors were major factors, but there was a big third factor also at play. See, many people say that, especially Sindhis on both sides of the borders. Many, in popular opinion, they say that there was less violence in Sindh and actually very little violence between Sindhi Muslims and Sindhi Hindus because Sindhis are a peace-loving people. There's a lot of culture of Sufism. Now, there is some truth to that, but Sindh also had a history of communal riots, of communal friction, communal violence. There had been some more violence. In fact, this is what my main point is, that there had been major riots in the northern Sindh town of Sakhar in November 1939. Okay. Now, at that time, there was a controversy over this mosque called Manzilga, which, as it happened, would be an uncanny precedent for the Babri Masjid. Here it was the Muslims who were popularizing this controversy in order for the Muslim League to gain traction in Sindh. Okay. And the Hindus opposed the return of this mosque to the mosque which was called Manzilga. They opposed the return. So it became a communal controversy. So one thing led to another, and communal riots broke out on 19 November in Sakhar. Now, Sakhar, to make matters worse, Sakhar had a history of having more communal friction. You know, So in Sakhar town, I would say um, there were Hindus and Muslims attacked by each other, but the violence also spread to the outlying villages, the neighboring villages. And there, it was mostly the Hindus who got attacked. Okay, and you have the president of the Sindh Congress, Dr. Chotram Gidwani, who made a tour of these villages soon after the riots, and he saw, I mean, horrific violence. He entered houses where the doors had been hacked open with axes, where there was blood spattered on the floor, on the ceiling, on the walls, where cow sheds had been burnt with the animals still in them. So the reason I'm mentioning all this violence is for two reasons. One is to show that it's not true that Sindhis are peace loving all the time. So there is a propensity to violence, which is only natural because, I mean, I would say natural, quote unquote. I mean, they're only human beings after all. So they are not superhuman to be above violence. Okay, so that's number one. Number two is this brings me to my main point. Now, soon after the Sakhar violence, there was a lot of regret among um, some Hindu leaders and some Muslim leaders for having brought the friction to this level, you know. And this was very much alive in public memory in 1947. People still remembered that violence, they remembered that kind of friction and those riots and everything. And in the minds of some Muslim leaders, I mean, like for example, the very well known leader GM Sayed, he clearly said it was a ghastly tragedy. Now, the chief minister of Sindh, who was Khuro, he may not have expressed his opinion in such strong words, but even he, I think, realized, his daughter writes in his biography, that they realized that what was needed was compromise. That if they wanted to live peacefully in that province, what they needed was compromise. So there was some degree of acknowledgement of regret. And to my mind, this I find very interesting, that the perpetration of violence can carry within it the potential for future remorse. In fact, when I was circling back to what I was telling you about Dr. Nandi's project, which was on specifically violence and which covered, Punjab, Bengal, parts of India, I mean, Bangladesh as well, and Sindh also. Many of the people who were covering areas like Punjab and Bengal, especially, where there had been clearly lots of, I mean, very high level of violence, many people would, many of these researchers would come and say that the people they were pointed to, whom they had heard had even perpetrated violence, these erstwhile perpetrators were not forthcoming. They were not proud of what they had done. At some level, I have a feeling they did feel some sense of remorse or shame or guilt. You know. Now, I'm not sure this would happen even today because we see cases where, for example, perpetrators of violence are felicitated or garlanded. There was a case in Rajasthan where people who were suspected or I think guilty of lynching were actually were felicitated. Or you have the famous case of the killer of Salman Taseer, who was showered with rose petals. So you do have exceptions to that, but I do think that it is possible that the actual act of perpetrating violence can carry with it, the potential for future remorse.
Yes,
So that's what I
also
think.
the trauma of the perpetrators has also been studied along with those of the victims,
Right,
because
right,
they
right.
also lead a life of traumatized life after when they realize that what they have done and what they
Absolutely.
had come to. Yes.
That's right.
I wanted to ask you one question, ma'am, that when you say that Sindhi government was committed to maintaining peace,
Right,
they wanted to maintain peace at all, at all costs. Who
right.
were these Sindhi government composed of? What was it composed of? Like they were Britishers? Were they, which party people were there? Uh,
So they
whom are
were
you
they were
referring to?
largely Sindhi Muslims. They were largely Sindhi Muslims, or Muslims who had come and settled in Sindh over the last 100 years. So they were Sindhi Muslims primarily. We're not talking about the Britishers. We are not even talking. So obviously, Sindhi Hindus did not have much role to play. You had the Pakistan government also in Karachi at the time, and they had a very different uh, approach to this, shall we say? Because the Sindh government was very clearly committed to maintaining law and order, and in order to do that, for example, if there were some muhajirs who had come to Sindh and found they were homeless, they were reduced to living on the footpath or in camps. Some of these muhajirs even forcibly occupied Hindu property, Hindu homes, and Hindu shops, and so on. So, if the Sindh government took action against these muhajirs, if they were arrested, put in jail, or whatever, um, there was a lot of outcry from the muhajirs that how can you do this? How can you arrest muhajirs, for doing this? But the Sindh government was very clear that no, we have to maintain law and order. And ultimately, of course, it is well known that anti-Hindu and anti-Sikh pogroms broke out in Hyderabad on December 17th, 1947, and in Karachi on January 6th, 1948. And it is widely acknowledged that these pogroms were largely perpetrated by muhajirs. Okay, not so much by Sindhi Muslims who had more of a passive role if they did not actively help Sindhi Hindus. Hmm. And even during those riots, even during that pogrom, the chief minister and even other ministers of the Sindh government, of the Pakistan government, they went out into the city, or if they happened to be passing through the city, they would help the Hindus who were being attacked. They would try and put an end to the violence. The chief minister Khudo, who was actually otherwise known for his anti-Hindu remarks, he actually took a gun, went out into the city, and fired in the air to scare away the troublemakers. And so, coming back to what I was saying earlier, for this he was reprimanded. He was castigated by Liaquat Ali Khan, who was then the Prime Minister of Pakistan, saying that you are supporting the Sindhi Hindus. You know, you have to. You have even killed some Muhajirs in firing. So there were different takes. I think the Sindhis have had a very different take as opposed to the Muhajirs in that respect.
So we like see the Sindhis as the peace-loving people, but they had a lot of difficulty in when they came here to India after migration. They had a problem in rehabilitation. They had to struggle a lot in resettlement and reassimilation with the new environment.
Right.
And this struggle also you have threw some light in your book. I will and I can. The
Yes.
story of the Jai Hind College. So what
Right.
do you have to say about that?
So, I Will and I Can was a book commissioned by the Jain College to document its founding and its history. Now, I don't know, Jain College, as many of you may know, if you're familiar with Bombay, is one of Mumbai's premier colleges. Um, it, however, started its life as Karachi's premier college. So, that's the irony. Um, Karachi's college, DJ Sindh College, which was not only Karachi's but Sindh's very first college, had a lot of Hindu professors as well as Hindu students. So when these professors and students migrated to India, to Bombay specifically, the professors decided to restart the college here, and they were able to do it, believe it or not, in only 4 months flat. I mean, that is just mind boggling. How you can just set up a restart an institution in 4 months flat. Of course, they didn't have a building, so they borrowed the premises of Elphinstone College. But I mean, it's just amazingly inspiring to me that they could do this. And when they went for help to various ministers in the Bombay government, of course, that time it was the Bombay province, the Bombay province. So people like Morarji Desai and other people, they had a lot of trouble even convincing them. And here again, we come back to the lack of violence or the relative lack of violence in Sindh. That they were seen as, you see, the Bombay government and many other governments, including the Sindh government, Delhi, you name it, everyone found it very difficult to deal with rehabilitation of refugees. So they didn't want the refugees. Okay. In many cases, the refugees were unwanted. So they were trying to convince the Sindhis to go back. They said there's not been that much violence in Sindh. You people are cowards. Now, here I also want to mention one thing, that violence is not always physical. You can have intimidation, you can have the fear of violence, So, these factors are also there, and there had been because Sindh had experienced such low levels of violence till December 47. They were therefore Sindh was the only province which had the largest number of minorities, and these minorities experienced the brunt of communal discrimination in those first few months of Pakistan's life. There was a very high degree of communal discrimination because there was a very high degree of communal friction, of communal antipathy at that time. And this is true, for example, even in, say, Delhi, where Muslims were discriminated against and so on. Okay. There, of course, it was Hindus. So these, now Mahatma Gandhi realized this, and he understood that this kind of non-physical violence, this kind of intimidation, communal discrimination, he says this is called killing by inches. It was not physically killing, but it's killing by inches, a very slow, gradual erosion of a community. So most other people did not recognize that. So people like Morarji Desai actually tried to convince T.M. Advani, who was the founder principal of Jain College, he told him, you go back, you people are cowards. You haven't seen that much violence, you go back, because they were comparing it with Punjab or Bengal. But T.M. Advani stood his ground, and he said, you have no idea what we have come away from, and you have no idea what we have of our spirit. And we are going to do this. And what I find amazing is that the determination itself brought about the results. And that is embodied in the motto of the college, which is I will and I can. So not only is it the motto of the college, and not only is it for the students, it also reflects how this college itself was founded. But I also feel it is something larger. It applies to Sindhi refugees, as to how they re-establish themselves in India against all odds.
Yeah, I think it applies to all the refugees who came
Absolutely,
here and they
absolutely, absolutely.
displayed the
Yes,
spirit of resilience in the face of.
yes, yes. Yeah, yeah. Because the thing about refugees is they know there is no turning back. So they have no choice but to make it happen.
Yeah, yeah, they had no other choice but to rebuild their lives again. Yeah.
Right,
Uh, um, Ma'am, your latest book, Cindynama, when I read this name, it sounded like the Akbarnama or Babarnama, if I can relate
right.
to them. And they were the official chronicles of those kings. So, like, it's a very large format, very well illustrated book, and a very
Right.
fascinating one as well. Tell us more about it, like how it came into existence and what does it entail for the Sindhi heritage.
Okay, so this again takes me. I'll just rewind a little bit to our previous conversation. We were talking about Sindhis settling in India. So, by and large, most Sindhis have resettled beautifully. They've, done very well for themselves. But this has come at a price, and the price is that they have been so focused on the future, they've completely turned their backs on the past, which means their Sindhi heritage, their Sindhi culture, the Sindhi language, which is now in the doldrums because people don't want to speak in Sindhi, and they feel they really feel it is a language of the past. If you want to be modern, you're not going to speak Sindhi. You know, so um, here I would like to mention the co-creator of my book. Can we have a photograph, please? Okay, so this is Geeta Simoes, and she and I created this book together. Now, Geeta was a Sindhi by birth. She married a Goan, and her surname became Simoes later. But she was a Sindhi by birth, and she was very familiar. Her grandfather continued to live in Sindh, so she would keep going there on visits. And she was very familiar with Sindhi arts, Sindhi textiles, Sindhi handicrafts, Sindhi music, Sindhi Sufism, and she was a designer of coffee table books, and it was her passion to do one on Sindh, on Sindhi culture, and so on. So she and I teamed up, and it was a great partnership because I was doing the text and the content, and she was also participating in the content, and she had a phenomenal eye for design, for style, for visuals, for everything. Okay. The tragedy is that Geeta passed away before the book was completed, but it was really her passion and her baby, and I really hope that we did our best to bring it out how to her high standards. I hope that is the case. Um, so we were very keen, Geeta and I, to do a book on Sindhi culture for Sindhis in India and in the diaspora, to give them an idea of their heritage, of their culture. So this book basically it covers all of Sindh. Okay, it's got 9 chapters covering nine different regions of Sindh. It covers pretty much all of Sindhi history. It covers like some notable personalities of Sindh. It covers various legends, the most notable legends of Sindh. It covers some recipes. Geeta was like quite a foodie. She said we have to have some food in the book. It's not a recipe book, but it does have some recipes. And it's got a lot of amazing photographs, most of which are by Nadeem Khawar, but there are many other brilliant images as well. Some are historic from places like the British Museum, the British Library, the V&A, and many people and institutions all over the world. So this book has actually been a collaborative effect. And here I would like to mention Tina Nasirabadwala, who took on the mantle of designer after Geeta, and also Brinda Somaya, who is a publisher of the book. And I would say the whole team, and Nishita Mehta, who did the visual research. So the whole team really worked hard to, you know, bring out a book to the best of our abilities. So um, one reason, like I said, was to acquaint younger Sindhis of what their families had left behind, or even of the land that their families came from, the cities that their families came from. So that was one part of it. But there was another part of it also, and this was equally, if not more important. And that aspect was that Sindh has had, again coming back to what we had talked about in the beginning, Sindh has had a very strong Sufi culture. Okay, it has had its moments of violence as well. I'm not denying that, but it has had a very strong Sufi culture and a strong culture of humanism. And what I mean by that is to see another individual without the labels of Hindu, Muslim, without the labels of Shia, Sunni, or even caste. Okay, so you see them as human beings, and in the Sufi culture, you serve God by serving human beings. So there was a lot of that. You see, for example, in the city of Shikarpur, the northern city of Shikarpur, there was a very famous saint called Khatawaro Baba. Okay, now he was originally just a simple man, and he was a very deep devotee, very strong follower of Guru Nanak. So when Guru Gobind Singh went to war, he said, I will sign up and join his army. Okay. And his job was to give water to all the injured soldiers on the battlefield. So he is going around giving water to these injured soldiers, and he is giving water to everyone. He's giving water to the Sikh soldiers, he's even giving water to the Muslim soldiers. So his other colleagues, they got very annoyed with him and they took him to Guru Gobind Singh. So Guru Gobind Singh, he said, who should I mean, in front of Guru Gobind Singh, he said, to whom should I give water? To whom should I not? I mean, this is the finest example of humanism, where you're just moved by the suffering of the man on the ground. You can't help but give him water, whether or not he's your enemy. So Guru Gobind Singh was very pleased with his answer, of course, and said, okay, you go and lead a life of spirituality. And then on the flip side, you have Sindh's um, most eminent poet saint, who was Shah Abdul Latif. And very early in his life, in his spiritual search, in his seeking, for the Almighty, he had left home and gone wandering with a group of Hindu yogis, Hindu sannyasis. And he wore saffron, he wore geru like them, you know. And he went wandering with them, and they went to all kinds of holy places, whether they were Hindu or Muslim or any kind of holy places. And after 3 long years, he came back. Now, when he came back, his father was not happy. Now, this was a family of Sayyids. Now, Sayyids claim descent from Prophet Muhammad, and this son has gone wearing, saffron robes like a Hindu. So the father was not happy at all. So he I mean, he said this is in verse form. I'm not going to recite the verses, but the father said that the Almighty is everywhere. Why did you go looking for him in Hinglaj? Now, Hinglaj is a Shakti Peeth of the goddess in Balochistan. He said, why did you go looking for him in the Almighty in Hinglaj? Implying that, you are sort of, this is a sort of a more inferior belief system. But what Shah Latif did was he responded in another verse and he said, the Almighty was everywhere and I found him also at Hinglaj. You know. So again, another way of asserting that ultimately all religions are different paths to the same goal. You know. So this is the kind of very deep humanity that Sindh has been heir to. Okay, that is also very much part of Sindhi heritage, and this is also what I try to bring in this book. Okay, now unfortunately, since, like I mentioned, Sindhi Hindus in India are unaware of their heritage. There's been no Sindh in India because Sindh was never partitioned, and with the visa system the way it is, Sindhi Hindus don't get to go to Sindh as easily as they could. I mean, very few get to go. On the other hand, also, um, in a Muslim state, the Hindu history of a region, the Hindu history, and mind you, Sindh has had more than Hindu. It has had a Jain history. It has had a Buddhist history. So all these other histories tend to get either sidelined or forgotten. So I felt this book is would be a good avenue to at least bring that back into the public eye. To bring this very very rich, multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic history that
Yes, this
and
uh,
yes, very
synthesis
very
of culture, this you have tried to
exactly
show through all the pictures in the
exactly
book.
exactly
Yes.
exactly. So it's that's really what the book is about, what it wants to celebrate. Yeah.
So, can we also have a look at the PPT?
Yeah, sure. So this is these are all pictures from the book. These images are all by Nadeem Khawar, who's a very very talented photographer from Lahore. This is a shrine of Sachal Sarmast. This is the same. Yeah, it's the same. This both these pictures are the same. This is in the Raza Sharif. This is the fort of Port Diji in northern Sindh. This is a Jain temple in the Thar Parkar area. It's no longer in use, of course. There are no Jains also, and the temple is in disrepair. This is a shrine where the Dargah of Shah Abdul Latif at Bit Shah near Hyderabad, Sindh. This is, of course, this does not need any explanation. This is the famous mound of Mohenjo-daro. This is a a carving of Krishna with the gopis and cows. This is from the Hindu temple of Sad Belo, which is again at Sakkar, on an island in the middle of the river. These are old Havelis. This is a facade of an old Haveli from Shikarpur. Shikarpur was home to a large number of very rich money lenders and who had a network all over Central Asia, Iran, India. I mean, India as it was then, and even China.
And who are mostly Hindus? Were they mostly
Yes, yes, of
Hindus?
course. Yes, yes. This is a Mohana boy sitting on his boat. Mohana are a community of fisher people, and they live almost, at least traditionally, they lived on their boats. Now, the drying up of the Indus and the drying up of the Mancha Lake is causing them problems. This is the Thar Parker Desert, the Thar Desert. This is the mausoleum of Mirza Isa Tarkhan II at Makli, which is one of the world's largest necropolises, which is adjacent to the erstwhile capital of Thatta in southern Sindh. This is the Sheesh Mahal, which is next to Port Diji, which we saw earlier. So this is Sheesh Mahal, which was one of the palaces of the Talpurs, who were the rulers just before the British took over. And this is a beautiful girl from the Thar area. This is again Going back to Makli, this is a tomb of Jam Nizamuddin. This is one of the earliest tombs built there, and you can see the Rajput influence, in the carvings and so on.
So, ma'am, what is the, are these ruins still kept in, somebody trying to preserve them, or are they in a state of, they are being devastated and destroyed further?
Well, the Sindh Archaeological Department is has been doing it, making its efforts, and these images that you've seen are modern images. They are not old images, So they are the monuments are pretty much like it is, but uh, also at the end of the day, in people in India and people in Pakistan, the mentality is not that different, to be honest. And in some cases, I've heard of graves being cemented over for protection. So I mean, what kind of protection is that? So
I think after it has been documented in your book, it will be preserved for the scholars, and anybody who is interested to know about Sindhi heritage would find it there and all the information that comes along with it. Thank you so much for joining us here today, ma'am. It was a great pleasure talking to you this evening.
thank you so much, Aprajita, and thank you so much to the entire team at the 1947 Partition Archive. I've always enjoyed these discussions. So thank you very much.
And those who are joining us, please tune in tomorrow for another amazing conversation with Anam Zakaria, author of The Footprints of Partition. The 1947 Partition Archive is hosting this series to commemorate 75 years of partition. This series is a daily micro podcast series being aired for 75 days between June 3rd and August 17th, except Sundays, to commemorate the 75th anniversary of partition in 2022. For context, August 17th is the day the Boundary Commission announced the Radcliffe Line separating India and Pakistan. 75 days after the partition plan was announced on June 3rd, 1947. Thank you very much again, and please show us your love and support by sending the hearts and like emojis under the video. For any query, DM us on social media or connect with any of our team members. Thank you so much.